So what this is about, we're going to talk about what is internal communications and why should you care? How it can help your company be, how it can help you, and be the secret weapon for your success. Then we're going to talk about things like some cost-effective strategy, tactics, and tools that you can use for do-it-yourself internal communications. The thing is, in any company of any size, unless you're just one person and talking to the voices in your head, you've got internal communications going on. So, what this talk is about how to be more intentional about it and how to have some structure and some practice. And also, this will just give you some ideas for how to do it more effectively to connect with people in your organization. I'm also going to have a short, small business case study that will talk about how developing an internal communications program helped them reduce turnover, become more agile, and really had some good business results. And like I said, this talk is really about people who want to do internal communications on a do-it-yourself basis. But I'm also here, and one of the things that I do is that, I offer fractional expertise if you're looking for. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Also, I can't see any questions that you might ask during the presentation. So but if you've got anything, you can pop it in the chat, and we can answer it, after I'm done talking here. So, like I said, let's talk about how to get your secret weapon to drive business results. First of all, like, who am I? And why should you listen to me? So I've worked for a few companies that you might have heard of, like Meta, LinkedIn, Tesla, and Expedia. And I've seen the impact that good internal communications can have on large, complex organizations. And I've also seen the impact sometimes whenever communications aren't done all that well, and the impact it can have on morale, on agility, on turnover, things like that. So, what I've done for the past decade or so is working with leaders to help them navigate the complexities of change and growth. And it's really about helping ensure that their employees, their people they're informed, that they're engaged, and that they're aligned with whatever the company's strategy is. So they understand how the work they do ladders up to company strategy. And a lot of what I do is really focusing on leadership support. Leaders are brilliant at starting companies. You have amazing ideas, things that are going to change the world. Not necessarily professional communicators, and that's fine. Everyone can't be. So a lot of what I do is helping leaders find that voice inside themselves and learning how to say with clarity what are the top three things that you want people to know whenever they've finished talking to you, how do you want them to feel. So that's really been my professional experience in a nutshell. And as we're going to move forward, I just want you to consider how clear and effective communication can help you transfer your organization, take it to the next level. So, this quote here, if you could see what I see, you'd probably make similar decisions. This is what a CEO that I used to work with would say a lot. In small meetings, in all hands meetings, whatever. And what he really meant was that he didn't really think that there was any particular magic to what he was doing, other than that he had a lot of experience in business. And also in his senior leadership role as running the company, he had access to lots of information that frontline employees, people throughout the organization, they didn't necessarily have. And some of it's confidential, proprietary, but whatever. But there were things where he could see ahead into what was the competition doing, where were they growing in ways that his business wasn't, and things. So a lot of what he would say is that if you could see what I see, you'd probably make similar decisions. And so what that's about is, while you can't necessarily, whenever you're working with people, it's not necessarily a great idea to share every single thing you know, plus also who's got time for the brain dump. But it's a good idea to sort of think through, are there things that I'm seeing? Are there, reasons why I'm making these decisions? What's going on that, if I could share this with the people in my organization, maybe that would help them understand. Sometimes just knowing the why is really half the battle. So I just always try to I think that internal comms, a lot of it is just sort of helping people understand what you're seeing as a leader, as a founder. So just really briefly, I'm going to go through internal communications 101. What is it? Like I said earlier, every company of any size that's over one person has internal communications. Just whether or not you've got an intentional person in the role or someone who it's their part-time job, it's happening whether or not you've got anyone dedicated to it. But so internal communications are, I really think, a couple of things. One of them are major moments, like you're launching a new product, you're going to IPO, you're like you've got a new round of funding, or something that's a little bit maybe less of a big deal, but all hands meetings where you've got all of the people in your company talking at once, or listening to you at once, merger and acquisition activity, reorgs, other significant changes. So internal comms is very much about these sort of big moments that you, when it's done well, you want employees to understand what just happened, what's about to happen, what's in it for me, how is this going to affect me, what can I expect on the road ahead. That's one function of internal communications. There's another one that we often call business as usual, and that's ongoing things, quarterly business updates. Obviously, if you're, pre-IPO, you're not giving out proprietary or confidential financial data, but still, sometimes it's often a good idea to have these sorts of quarterly updates. Or if you're big enough that you might actually start having benefits communications, compensation communications. And compliance is often an issue in companies of over a certain size. So these sorts of things, again, if they're done well, then they can look really cool to employees, make employees think, oh, I'm part of a really great organization that cares about me and that is doing this stuff well, versus stuff that can be more robotic or more amateurish looking, which maybe wouldn't have the same impact. So the purpose of all of this internal communications, again, if done intentionally, if done well, it's keeping employees connected to your company's goals, helping them feel good about the culture, also creating a culture. What is the kind of place that you want to create? And then also helping employees understand if there are changes going on, what is their role in it, and also helping them feel like they've got a part in change. The change isn't just happening to them, that they could actually be a change agent, a change maker, and feel excited about this. So this is what internal communications done well can do. And here are some other things, about how to make internal communications really effective. So the first thing is, like I said earlier, good internal communications, really the goal is to align employees with the company's strategy. And that alignment is really essential. You want to make sure that people in your organization are moving towards common goals. So it's not just about sharing the facts, it's really about finding a way to keep people inspired and engaged in what's going on in their work, especially during times of change. That's really a very important part of communication, is helping people understand what change might be happening and how they can be a part of it. The other thing about good internal communications is that you can't sell things, and I'm putting this in air quotes. I mean, generally you're not trying to sell things to employees unless you're running a multi-level marketing business, which I don't think any of us are doing necessarily here. But what I mean by sell is that people who work at your company know what's going on. They've got some insight into the business already. So I always think that it's very important to have clear, honest, authentic messaging that's, you know, you can be optimistic, but sometimes people make a mistake of being kind of disconnected from reality because they want to be so optimistic. I'm remembering there was a CEO at a company I worked for a while, and she sent out a company-wide message saying, "The future has never been brighter for us. I'm so excited about this." 3 weeks later, there was a mass layoff, and about 20% of the company's employees were gone. it just causes a disconnect. And you saw that you would see the scathing reviews on Glassdoor, sort of nasty message on Slack, things like that. And whenever leaders do things like that, it kind of tanks credibility. So that's what I mean by not selling. And then the last thing is really about keeping the employee's perspective in mind. That's the other thing, is that sometimes people make the mistake of just repurposing marketing communications. You've got a press release, you've got a TikTok, you've got something you post on Instagram or whatever, and sometimes that, and it's okay to share that internally. But what some people often make the mistake of is that's all they do. And those external comms are great for one purpose. But what they often don't include is what's in it from the employee's perspective. Why would this new feature, why would this new product, why would this new service, why would this new partnership, how is that going to benefit me as an employee? So I do invite you to think of whenever you're communicating with your people, put yourself in their shoes and why would they care? If you've got some new process or some new partnership that's going to save the company money, that's nice. That's not necessarily helping out an employee. But if it's saving the employee time, if it's making their life easier, then that is something that's worth highlighting. So, all right, all of this sounds great. It's, and I often get asked, okay, well, what's the ROI on this? Why would I care? Why should I do this? And I think the main benefit of good internal communications, one of the most tangible ones, is lower turnover. And we'll get to this in an example I'll have in a few minutes. But where if employees feel like they're at a company that cares about them, that they actually understand what the strategy is, that they feel like, oh, I'm on a great rocket ship that's going to go places, they tend to stay. They also tend to tell their, high performing friends that might want to work for you about you as well. And one of the things I've researched, and this is a figure, and you can look up yourself, but it pretty commonly is the cost of turnover. And so if people leave the organization, it generally costs anywhere between 50 to 200% of an employee's annual salary to replace them. It's the lost time in productivity. It's having to find someone else, all of that. So, and the 200% is really for more senior roles, whereas the 50% is somewhat more junior. But that's a huge loss to an organization. So, better communication can definitely help reduce turnover. And I think that's the main ROI of this. Like I said, it's not just about retention. It's also helping employees understand and embrace change because change is just a constant right now. One of the things I've run into over and over again is that changes happen or leaders want to introduce a change and they're on board. They understand why it needs to happen. But what often happens is they don't necessarily explain why the change needs to happen very well to the rest of the organization. And sometimes even just explaining, here's what's going on. Here's why we need to do this. This is what the competition is doing. They're eating our lunch. And we need to pivot to do this other thing. Sometimes even that sort of basic connecting the dots doesn't quite happen. And people don't understand the change. So they, passively resist. They don't really quite get what's going on. And it sometimes causes changes to fail, or just not work out the way that you would intend. So really, a lot of internal communications is about helping your people adapt to new directions and be able to move forward. Other thing is that, whenever communication works well, employees feel inspired and motivated. Their productivity and their ability to be agile and pivot quickly can improve. Whenever employees feel engaged and inspired, they bring their best selves to work, and that really drives your organization forward. So, what we're going to talk about a bit next is, how these benefits can transform your organization. They create a more sustainable workforce, they enhance your business performance. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how to you strategically achieve some of these terrific outcomes. First, I'm going to talk about is these are some basic tactics that you can use to, in any organization of any size, and they don't necessarily cost a lot of money. But one thing I do want to caution you about is that sometimes people jump to a really cool tactic. Ooh, there's this great new Slack poll feature. Ooh, we should do videos that look like TikTok. Those are all really cool. But I would always encourage anybody before you jump to a tactic, you really need to come up with a strategy first. What are these tactics for? Why are you doing them? Why are you spending a lot of time on them? So, first thing you should do, come up with a strategy. And it doesn't have to be anything really formal. In fact, as quickly as business shifts these days and as much as goes on, sometimes formal isn't necessarily that great, but still, like maybe one page in a Google Doc or something is just think through the answers to some questions here. First question is, what are the top three, four at most priorities for employees? I've worked at organizations times that had 12 priorities. None of them got done. Really, people have, sometimes a hard time thinking in terms of more than three or four. I mean, who can keep up with all of that? But try to focus on what are the top three or four things. Is it better customer service, adopting a new tool, whatever? But just make sure that you're clear in your mind about what are the top three priorities that you want people to focus on in the next month or the next 3 months. The next question you might want to answer yourself is, are there behaviors you want to encourage? Are you not seeing collaboration work as well among teams? Are you, people not speaking up whenever something isn't working out? Like if, some software product is just not getting out on time, is there some issue there? Or are there processes that you've got people that have launched, but people aren't following? So again, is there behavior that you want to influence? That should be part of your strategy as well. And then I guess the last question that I would invite you to think about as you're developing your strategy is, are you aware of any big changes that are happening? Even if you can't tell the employees what the changes are, like there's some M&A that might be happening potentially, or some, big shift or pivot that you might know in your back pocket, just make sure that you're aware of it. So even if you can't necessarily say something explicitly to employees, sometimes you can drop breadcrumbs. Maybe it's a tone shift in the way that you're talking to your people, but just have that in the back of your mind. So, okay, you've thought through those questions, you have your amazing strategy for the next quarter or so. Now let's move on to some tactics. And these are things I really, as I was coming up with this, I was thinking through what could someone do, themselves with off the shelf tools. And, so let me just talk a little bit about each one of these. The first one, what I'm calling pulse surveys, there are actually tools you can buy. But again, we're not talking about spending money here, but there are actually pulse survey tools that, I don't know, they're like $5 or $10 a head or something. And for larger organizations, those are great. But even if you don't necessarily have the budget for that, just think through, are there ways that I could survey my employees? And, there are lots of things. There's SurveyMonkey, there's Google Forms, there's also polls in Slack. And they're really cool. If you just posted something on Slack and it's a big news announcement or something, think about appending a poll to it and maybe asking a question at the end about how well do people understand that, or how excited are people feeling about it on a scale of 1 to 10. Even just little basic hints of information like that. People like to respond to polls. People like to be asked. And so it's a cool thing. One warning though, it's always possible to over survey people. So I don't necessarily, encourage you to append a survey to every single communication. Definitely be thoughtful, planful about it. But, this is a good, like low cost way to, instead of just imagining what people are thinking, oh, you can ask them. It's always a good thing. Next thing are internal social platforms. I mean, Slack is one of my favorites. I mean, there are others as well, but Slack is really good for starting to have, if you want to start putting out messages routinely about things that are going on in the organization. Make sure you have a dedicated channel for it though, like some sort of company-wide announcements thing, so you're not cluttering up people's Slack inboxes. But it's a good sort of low lift way to get your message across. The next one Email. I know some people think email is kind of uncool and unfashionable, and not every organization uses it. And I've seen some that don't use email at all, others that do. And one of the things that I found through asking employees what they like is that a lot of people actually really like email. Not for every single communication, but things like, if you're, in this case, I was talking about maybe send out an email from yourself every week or every month, just, sort of checking in with people, saying what's going on with the business and, some sort of monthly, some sort of from the founder email. The reason why people like email is that unlike Slack or any sort of async communication like that, there's less of an urgency to it. People don't feel like, oh my God, I have to respond to this email right now. Also, sometimes they're easier to search, especially if you use a consistent header every time whenever you're sending these. So I would encourage you, again, sometimes this sounds like Microsoft Office from 1997, but these things work and people actually like these little sort of newsletter things. The other thing, if you're visually inclined and if you've got the chops for it, try to, incorporate some sort of visual storytelling. These things can often work really well. Some people love talking into their phone and having some sort of little TikTok style update. You then just broadcast it across Slack. It can be a nice, fun little thing, and you can be, sort of impromptu, unguarded. People respond to that sort of thing. One thing also I did want to talk about a bit whenever we're talking about messages is that everyone isn't necessarily a professional writer. So, of course, everyone's using ChatGPT, Claude, whatever. That's great. Those AI tools are wonderful for first drafts. Please, please don't just send out your first drafts. I find that like anything that I come up with in AI, always have to customize it to my tone of voice and also make sure that it's not just making stuff up. So that's one thing. Also, I found is that AI now, like a lot of AI tools, will try to create graphics, try to create simulated photographs, infographics, whatever. As far as I've seen, they're really not necessarily ready for prime time yet. A lot of the infographics still have a lot of kind of errors, like weird looking text. The photographs often look like sort of old stock photos with everyone in really kind of formal business attire. And often they look robotic, or even in 2025, like you would think that like some of these visual AI tools would be better. But I would just caution you, look carefully at these things before you pump out any sort of AI work product. So the next thing that I also wanted to talk about, sort of a low lift, is employee spotlights. Surely there is something good that's gone on in the organization or something really cool that someone's been working on. Maybe someone closed a sale that you feel like needs to be trumpeted. So try and find ways to recognize employees that way. Like a dedicated Slack channel is really, really good for that, company-wide recognition, whatever. But something like that where you're praising people for a good job. Obviously, people are working for the money. They, also working for the idea that, oh, I'm on some really cool rocket ship that's going to build the future. People also like to be recognized. They, want to feel seen. So never underestimate the power of just saying in a public forum, someone did an awesome job. It can go a long way. And then the last thing, again, can be kind of low lift depending on your skill set. But in tools like Slack, or not tools like Slack, tools like Canva or others, you can create sort of consistent templates for messaging. It sounds like, oh, wouldn't that just be decorative? But they really have a powerful impact. I mean, part of it is that it brands your communication as this is coming from the founder. This is something important you should attend to. This isn't just, me with some, sort of random message. So I would encourage you to think in terms of also, it saves you time later. Reproducible templates for things like an all hands invitation for a weekly or monthly message from the founder. Those can go a long way. And those are just a few of some of the, not very expensive tactics that you can use to help with your communication strategy. So, okay. Next thing I wanted to talk about briefly is putting all this together. All these things I talked about, the tactics and strategy. Just wanted to give you a little case study of a small business that I worked with, not a startup, but around 300 employees, and it was growing rapidly. One of the things that they were running into was that employees didn't necessarily understand what the company they were working for was doing. They also had really, really high turnover, and that was sort of skyrocketing. People were leaving for the competition because they didn't understand what the company was doing. And like we talked about earlier, that costs an absolute fortune. So I came in and helped the company, and let's talk through a little bit about how this worked with by launching a strategic internal communications program to address and overcome these challenges. So first thing, sat down with the CEO and the leadership team about what was the strategy. And the strategy was to help employees understand here's where we are in the marketplace. Here's how we're addressing the competition. This is why, we're the best employer in this particular area and, for what we do. And so with all of that together, started to come up with a communication strategy that would show this. And there were a couple of different ways we did this. One is by having the CEO talk regularly. It wasn't just one email. We had them start to do a newsletter that went out to the entire company, talked about where the business was. And it was this sort of conversational tone that invited people to talk. The other thing is, launched a people manager communication channel. If a company gets beyond a certain size, you've got people that are managing other people. And that's often overlooked in these kind of communications is, do people managers have the tools? Do they actually know what to say to their teams in meetings? And so we created a specific channel just for people managers where, we could say, okay, here are the top three things we'd like for you to discuss with your employees over the next week. And that was a huge success. Launched a recognition program. It was relatively low cost. It was really just about getting, the CEO to go out to various offices and have their picture taken with employees and, thank them for a great job. But people absolutely loved that, especially because it was based on nominations. And so we could then, in a company-wide forum, whether in an all hands meeting or on the intranet or whatever, talk about here's this employee doing this exceptional job and here's how they've exemplified our values and driven the business forward. Huge morale boost. And people just absolutely loved having those stories. And then finally, we had an inexpensive pulse survey program where, this was $5 a head, but like I said, there are ways of doing this for free as well, where every month we'd ask people one question. It would be a sort of open-ended thing where, can you tell us how you're feeling? And this is an optional thing. And then the other question was on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling about your work with the company? And so we would get this snapshot in time of how people were feeling. We could assess, what sentiment was like, and it was a really good way to check in with people. Low lift, didn't really have to, people didn't have to spend a lot of time on that, but it was a really good tool because that is the thing: is that how do you know how your communications are working unless you do some measurement, unless you have some systems in place to assess these things. So, the results spoke for themselves, but we had about a 10% reduction in turnover. So it was a huge, regrettable turnover, by the way. That's an HR term that you might see used sometimes, where people that you didn't want to leave didn't leave. And so that was just a huge cost savings right there. And just from the significantly higher survey results that we would see people present and people, feeling like, oh, wow, I didn't really know what we were doing before, but now I understand. And I feel like, we've got a good system going forward. made a huge difference having this program in place, and it really set the company up for success. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the next two slides, but what this is about, or the next things I was going to talk about, most of this talk is about do-it-yourself internal communications, and that's great. Especially if you're just starting out, it's just you know, not a lot of other people. Yeah, sure. These are all tools for you to do this without dedicated help. And like I said earlier, even if you don't have dedicated internal comms, you're doing internal comms already. It's just how well do you want to do it? But so with larger companies, what I find is that generally around 500 to 1,000 people or so is whenever most companies start to have a dedicated internal comms position. And that's usually some sort of senior manager or senior director role that's reporting to the chief people or the chief marketing officer. So there's that. And then, for smaller organizations, there's fractional internal comms, which, maybe you don't necessarily need someone full time, or you don't have the resources for this full time. But smaller organizations, sometimes you might need a little bit of extra help, or you've got some big moment coming up that you want to make sure is going well, like an all hands or an IPO or something. So this is where having a fractional person can work out. And a couple of different ways this works is that some people have a fractional person on retainer, if you've got bigger needs for that. Or there's also a project model, again, if there's just a one-off need, like you want to spin up, I don't have an all hands program for my company, but I want to learn how to do it well. And I want to make sure that there's some structure and some rigor here. Or I don't know how my employees feel about the company, but I want to set this up. So this is what a project model can work for as well. So last thing I wanted to talk about here is this is a little bit of a checklist. And like Marianne said, you're going to get a copy of this deck afterward. But these are just, checklist or, some things that you should have in mind whenever you want to do internal communications well. First thing is define your communication objectives. It's that strategy that I talked about earlier. You kind of need to know where it is you want to go or what you want to influence people to do. Make sure you're clear on that first. Next thing is that ensure your messaging is consistent. Don't say one week that the future has never been brighter, and then a week later the company is sold off, or you lay off a bunch of people. Make sure that there's consistent messaging. And if the business isn't doing as well as you might like, maybe you don't necessarily want to be frank about that, but there are ways of signaling that. Again, sort of breadcrumbs in the things that you're saying. Like I said earlier, encourage two-way communication. And this is just very important. A lot of the things I talked about earlier with Slack polls, with Google Forms, with all hands meetings, with making sure that your managers are having meetings with their direct reports. Just encouraging a lot of two-way communication and make sure that you're open and approachable for whenever your people are telling you how they feel about working there. Make sure that your updates are timely. Make sure that if there's some big change that's going to be happening, your people shouldn't find out about it in a social media post or a press release. Make sure that you're preparing them for the news that's going on. Be transparent. What I've talked about all along. You're not selling to your people. They already work there. So make sure that what you're talking about is authentic and that it's real and that it's connected to reality. And based on all the information that you're getting, about the business and about how people are feeling, just monitor and adjust, always improve. So, this is internal communications 101, just how you might be able to do it yourself. And, thank you very much for listening to my talk.